The Siege of Orléans, lasting from October 1428 to May 1429. The situation is as follows. The long-term English siege of Orléans, which was strategically located on the Loire River, had resulted in a terrible famine, and of course a drop in the morale of the French defenders. But it wasn't over yet. The arrival of Joan of Arc, a young visionary who claimed divine guidance, gave the beleaguered French troops a new hope and a new resolve. The army was inspired by her inspiring presence and charismatic leadership, which resulted in a string of decisive victories, finally ending the siege. But in addition to boosting French spirits, this incredible turnaround made it possible for Charles VII to be crowned the King of France, enhancing the legitimacy of his rule. The triumphant defense of Orléans is hailed as a testament to the tenacity and solidarity of the nation. It shows the significant influence of individual leadership in determining the path of history. And so, the final French victory in the 100 Years' War was greatly aided by the bravery and strategic cunning displayed during this siege, and is a tale certainly worth telling. And that's what we're going to do today, in stunning detail. Welcome to the channel. Here we are again, but now we go to the 100 Years' War between France and England. What a topic. Of course, if you like this kind of content, click the like and subscribe button, and you'll get more of it. And leave me your thoughts in the comments. Well, with that being said, let's get started. Nice and relaxed now. We start, of course, by mentioning the 100 Years' War. Everything happens within this context. If you don't know too much about it, I did a very detailed video on it. It goes for about, 3 hours or something. I guess it's a short introduction. But essentially it was an inheritance conflict between the French and the English ruling houses over the French throne. And it was within the context of this war that the Siege of Orléans took place. Now, because he was the son of Isabella of France and thus descended from the disputed French royal line, Edward III, the King of England at that time, made the decision to go ahead and assert his claim to the French throne in 1337. Of course, this was not received well by the French. Either way, the English took control of the war after a resounding victory at another famous battle in 1415. That was the Battle of Agincourt, and they now control a large portion of northern France. Henry V of England became the Regent of France in 1420 as a result of the Treaty of Troyes. In accordance with this agreement, Henry had wed Catherine, the daughter of Charles VI, who was the reigning French king, and would take the French throne after Charles had passed away. How complicated could it be? Well, it only gets complicated when somebody else wants to dip their toes into the royal succession. So Charles, the son of the French king, was then disinherited as the Dauphin of France, the title bestowed upon the French heir apparent. North central France's Orléans was situated on the Loire River. It was the northernmost city to remain faithful to the Valois French crown during the siege, so it was right on the front line. The remainder of northern France, including Paris, by the way, was ruled by the English along with their allies of Burgundian stock. Orléans was, in fact, the final barrier to a campaign into central France because of its location on a significant river. The southwest coast of France was also already under English control. So as you can see, Things were not looking very good for the French at this time. Perhaps they need a hero to come and save the day. Now we'll get to that. Of course, the city of Orléans was symbolic in the politics of early 15th century France as the capital of the Duchy of Orléans, a political group known as the Armagnacs, led by the Dukes of Orléans, actually opposed the Treaty of Troyes and backed the claims of the exiled and disinherited Dauphin Charles to the French throne. In fact, for 2 generations, this faction had existed. One of the few Agincourt fighters still held captive by the English 14 years after the battle was its leader, the Duke of Orléans, who was also vying for the throne. A city that submitted to an invading army without resistance was of course entitled to lenient treatment from its new ruler. That was under the chivalric customs. Think of it as kind of like a rules for war. Before we had the Geneva Convention, we had good manners, let's call them that. Wars are wars, of course, but you still act in a certain way that the Pope doesn't get too angry with you. Either way, a hostile occupation was to be expected of a city that resisted. This kind of situation frequently resulted in mass executions. Late medieval reasoning demonstrated that the English were forced to use violence because the city of Orléans had, in fact, intensified the conflict, which justified a conquering lord's retaliation against the populace. If the city fell, it was unlikely to be spared because of its ties to the Armagnac party. So in 1427, English and Burgundian forces reaffirmed their alliance and offensive against the Dauphin's France following the brief fallout over Hainault in 1425 and 1426. In addition to controlling the Loire, the Orléans region, southwest of Paris, was crucial for facilitating a seamless transition between the Burgundian area of operations in the east and the English area of operations in the west. You see, prior to the Anglo-Burgundian assault, French forces were, mainly ineffectual. However, in late 1427, they succeeded in forcing the Siege of Montargis to be lifted. The first successful French action in years, the relief of Montargis, encouraged the intermittent rebellions in the sparsely garrisoned English-occupied area of Maine to the west. Of course, that poses yet another threat to recent English victories. So the French court was enmeshed in an internal power struggle between the Chamberlain Georges de Tremoille, the new favourite of the Dauphin Charles, and the Constable Arthur de Richemont, which prevented the French from taking advantage of the aftermath at Montargis. Charles of Bourbon, Count of Clermont, the Marshal Jean de Brosse, and John Stuart of Darnley, who, by the way, led the Scottish auxiliary forces, were all allied with the Constable, while La Hire, Jean de Gentral, and John the Bastard of Orléans, also known as Dunois, were participants of La Tremoille. Now, by the middle of 1428, the internal French conflict had escalated to the point where their partisans were engaged in open combat. Thomas Montague, the 4th Earl of Salisbury, who was considered the most successful English commander of the time, brought a new force of about 2,700 men. Now that's 450 men at arms, and 2,250 longbowmen, pretty popular after Agincourt, to England in early 1428, taking advantage of this French paralysis. With the addition of the auxiliaries from Burgundy and vassal domains in Picardy and Champagne, these were strengthened by new levies raised in Normandy and Paris, potentially reaching a total strength of 10,000. That's a lot of guys. The English regent, John, Duke of Bedford, decided at the Council of War in the spring of 1428 that the primary goal of the English military campaigns were to be advance westward in order to crush the last of the Armagnac forces in the Maine and establish a siege to Angers. This plan did not initially include the city of Orléans. In fact, Bedford had negotiated a private agreement with Dunois, who was then enraged in the Berry and concentrating on the conflict between Richemont and La Trémoille. Since Charles, the Duke of Orléans, was then in captivity in England, it would have been against knightly war customs to take up prisoners' belongings. Shortly after the arrival of English reinforcements under Salisbury in July of 1428, Bedford, who had previously agreed to leave Orléans alone, suddenly had a change of mind. In a later memorandum, Bedford stated that the siege of Orléans was, I quote, taken in hand, God knoweth by what advice. And what does that mean? Well, it implies that Salisbury, not him, was most likely the one who came up with the idea. Just gonna handball that one off to somebody else, I suppose. Now, the Earl of Salisbury reclaimed Nogent-le-Roi, Rambouillet, and the region surrounding Chartres by sweeping through the countryside southwest of Paris between July and October. Then Salisbury made a sudden turn to the southeast towards Orléans, instead of continuing southwest to Angers. In August, Salisbury, pushing toward the Loire, took La Puisée and Jeanville, not without some resistance, but obviously it wasn't enough. Salisbury then skipped over Orléans to capture the countryside west of it, instead of coming down directly on it from the north. At Mont-sur-Loire, he arrived at the Loire River and quickly took control of it. A group of his men had crossed the river to raid the Abbey of Clery at that time. In order to reach the bridge and castle at Beaugency, he pushed slightly downstream towards Blois. Salisbury turned up the approach to Orléans from the south after crossing the Loire at that point. On October 7th, he reached Olivet, which is only a mile south of Orléans, getting a little bit close there. Unwanted advances. Well, meanwhile, an English force led by Jean de la Pole, the brother of the Earl of Suffolk, had been dispatched to capture the areas east of Orléans, that is, upriver. On October the 5th, Jargeau fell, followed immediately by Châteauneuf-sur-Loire, and further upriver, Sully-sur-Loire was taken from the Burgundians. What did that mean for Orléans? Well, it meant that they were cut off, and they were surrounded. Even if anybody was going to send any sort of aid, they would have to get through all of the areas that the English had already taken. It was not looking good. Jean of Dunois had kept an eye on the tightening English noose while manning the defences of Orléans, taking care to get the city nice and prepared for the siege. The nearly 1/4 mile bridge that connected the south shore of the Loire to the north shore of the city centre of Orléans was the main target of the English, as Dunois had correctly predicted. An ideal site for Salisbury to position English cannons within range of the city centre of Orléans was the riverine island of St. Antoine, which the bridge crossed. Les Tourelles, a turreted gatehouse at the southern end of the bridge, was situated in the river and connected to the southern bank by a drawbridge. With the help of the majority of his soldiers, Dunois quickly constructed a massive earthwork bulwark on the south shore, forming a vast fortified complex to guard the bridge. Now it appears that Dunois chose not to use the Augustinian friary located directly across from the boulevard, which could have served as a pretty good flanking fire position on any approach to the bridge. In fact, it was perfect. Why didn't he use that? Well, he just didn't. To avoid providing the English with cover, he ordered the evacuation of Orléans' southern suburbs, and of course the levelling of all buildings. An artillery barrage that started on October 17th marked the official start of the Siege of Orléans, which officially began on October 12th, 1428. But they had to make the preparations. On October 21st, the French used rope nets, scalding water, hot coals, quicklime, and missile fire to hold back the English attack on the boulevard. Now, I say scalding water. Sometimes it's said that they use scalding oil, but, well, they usually just mean water. Maybe tar sometimes, but why waste all the oil? You can just easily scare people away with hot water if you just want to burn people away, and that's usually just what they did. Anyway, after deciding against launching a fresh frontal assault, the English began to mine the bulwark. If you can't go over it, you must go under it. On October the 23rd, the French countermined, fired the pit props, and retreated to the Tourelles. However, the following day, October 24th, the Tourelles itself was overrun. To avoid a direct pursuit, the departing French detonated some of the bridge archers. Orléans appeared to be doomed at this point, after the Tourelles collapsed. However, the Marshal de Boussac and significant French reinforcements arrived just in time to stop the English from repairing the bridge, crossing it and taking Orléans right away. 2 days later, while overseeing the Tourelles' installation, the Earl of Salisbury was hit in the face by debris that was kicked up in the cannon fire, causing yet another setback for the English. Salisbury was taken to the Mung to recuperate, while English operations were more or less halted till further notice. Unfortunately for Salisbury, though, he didn't get to see much of it because he passed away from his wounds after a week or so. Now, the citizens of Orléans were able to knock out the remaining archers of the bridge on their end, during the lull in the English operations after Salisbury's death and injury, which eliminated the chance of direct attack and speedy repair. William de la Pole, the Earl of Suffolk, and the new siege commander that Bedford appointed in mid-November, decided to encircle the city and starve it out. And this was usually the strategy with sieges. It was so dangerous to try and get men up upon the walls, and most of the time, if you had enough surrounding countryside, which the English did, to try and get a bit of food from and water and all the rest, well, you had something that the people within the city did not have, and that was resources. So it's far better off just to play the waiting game, which is what they did, most of the time. Anyway, so he established a number of outworks, or bastides as they called it, because he lacked the manpower to establish continuous trench lines throughout the city. 7 strongholds were established on the north bank and 4 on the south bank over the course of the following few months. The bridges that had connected the 2 banks were controlled by the small riverine Isle of Charlemagne, which is located west of Orléans. A Burgundian force of roughly 1,500 men at this time arrived to assist the English besiegers during the winter. Certainly a welcome surprise. So the outworks construction, of course, was not without its own challenges. Couldn't make it too easy on them, couldn't we? In addition to consistently harassing the builders, which they did, the French garrison methodically demolished other suburban structures, and most notably, all of the churches. Why did they do that? Well, it's meant to stop the English from using them as shelter in the winter. The northeast of the city was essentially left open by the spring of 1429, when the English outworks only covered the south and west of the city. Although English patrols were still swarming the area, large groups of French men-at-arms could dislodge the patrols and enter and exit the city, but any lighter escorted supplies and provisions were firmly barred from the city and beyond. The Tourelles Boulevard and the now fortified Augustins made up the bridge complex, which served as the English centre on the south bank. The Bastille of Champ de Saint-Prive stood to the west of the bridge complex, while the Bastille of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc guarded the approach to the bridge from the east. Additionally, Saint-Prive protected the bridge leading to Charlemagne's Island, which had its own Bastille. The biggest English fortress and the focal point of English operations was the Bastille of Saint-Laurent, located across the Charlemagne Bridge and on the north bank of the Loire. The Bastille de la Croix-Bois, the Bastille de Deux-Pierres, known as the London, the Bastille de Pressoir-Alpes, known as the Rouen, and just north of the city, the Bastille de Saint-Poire, known as Paris, were a series of smaller outworks situated above that. Then came the great northeastern gap. Though the dense forest of the Bois d'Orléans covered most of its back. Lastly, the remote Bastille of Saint-Loup was located on the north bank about 2 kilometers east of the city. Orléans' attitude, of course, appeared to be pessimistic. That's probably the word for it, I'd say. Any assistance would have to come from Blois to the southwest, which is precisely where the English had concentrated their forces, even though the French still controlled the isolated citadels like Montargis to the northeast and Gien upriver. To get to the city from the northeast, supply convoys had to take risky detours that swung around. Not many, of course, survived, and the city soon started to suffer. If Orléans were to fall, the Dauphin Charles's attempt to regain the throne would be doomed, and the northern half of France would be virtually impossible to regain. The Dauphin was pressured to make peace with Philip III of Burgundy, at any cost during the September 1428 meeting at the French estates of Chinon. In October of 1428, the partisans of Richemont and Le Tremoille had quickly agreed to a temporary truce in response to the threat to Orléans. For the relief of Orléans, Charles de Bourbon, the Count of Clermont, gathered a French-Scottish army in Blois at the beginning of 1429. Clermont made the decision to detour in an attempt to intercept the English supply convoy that was being sent from Paris to the English siege troops under the command of Sir John Fastolf. A force led by Jean of Dunois from Orléans joined him after eluding the French defences. Because the English convoy was carrying a lot of fish for the upcoming Lenten season, the forces made a junction at Jeanville and attacked it at Rouvray on February 12th in what is known as the Battle of the Herrings. Herring is, well, that's the type of fish that they were taking. Very popular in England, herrings, especially smoked herring. Or so I've heard. I've never actually had it myself. I'm not a fan of fish. Too many little bones. Too risky. Far too risky for my liking. Anyway, aware of their approach, the English arranged the supply wagons in a lager formation, with bowmen lining the perimeter. The French were told to hold back and let their cannon do the heavy lifting by Clermont. Disappointed with the missile duel, however, the Scottish regiments under John Stewart of Darnley made the decision to advance. Uncertain of whether to follow or stay back as instructed, the French lines paused. The English then saw an opening, as the French were either immobilized or only timidly following. The hesitant French were thrown back as the English cavalry rushed out of the wagon fort and overpowered the lone Scots. Panic and chaos took hold, and the French began to flee. Jean of Dunois was injured, and Stewart of Darnley was killed. 3 days later, Falstaff triumphantly delivered the supplies to the English soldiers at Orléans. The morale of the French, well, it took quite a beating at the Rouvray defeat. Clermont and Dunois immediately began arguing and accusing one another of the fault of the catastrophe, each saying it was the other's fault completely, which of course reopened that rift between the Richemont and Le Tremoille parties. Disguised, Clermont left the field and withdrew to his estates, declining to continue his involvement. Charles, the Dauphin, was once more counseled to seek peace with Burgundy, and if that failed, to even think about abdicating. I'm sure they nervously told him that one. And then they advised that once he abdicated, he would retire to the Dauphin and possibly also go into exile in Scotland. Not the ideal situation. But if it comes down to saving one's skin, perhaps those sorts of decisions must be made. Well, on behalf of his imprisoned half-brother Charles, Duke of Orléans, John of Dunois made Philip III of Burgundy an offer in March that he hoped would be too good to refuse. Orléans would be given to him to maintain as a natural territory. Philip was approached by a group of the city's bourgeois and nobles who wanted to convince the Duke of Bedford to break the siege so that Orléans could instead surrender to Burgundy. The letter, written by a modern merchant, a contemporary merchant of the time rather, details the terms of the offer. It goes like this, that half of the city's taxes would go to the English and the other half would be used to pay the ransom for the imprisoned duke. Burgundy would have the authority to choose the city's governors on behalf of the Duke of Orléans, and, well, a few other little stipulations to make sure nobody tries to take any easy ways out. The siege was also to be lifted, and the city turned over to the Burgundians in exchange for the English gaining military access through Orléans and Bedford receiving a donation of 10,000 gold crowns for war expenses. The deal would have allowed the English to bypass Orléans and attack Bourges, the Dauphin's administrative capital, which had been the main driving force behind the siege. Early in April, Burgundy rushed to Paris to convince John of Bedford, the English regent, to accept the offer. However, Bedford refused to give up his prize, because he was convinced that Orléans was about to fall. Disappointed, Philip stormed out of the English siege with his Burgundian auxiliaries. The English had a very small army to carry out the siege after the Burgundian contingent departed on April 17, 1429. In the end, the choice turned out to be a disastrous error for the English, and frankly, a wasted opportunity. Now, here we get to the interesting part, the one you've been waiting for. A young French peasant girl by the name of Joan of Arc was meeting with Robert de Baudricourt, the Dauphinois captain of Vaucouleurs, on the day of the Battle of the Herrings. She was attempting to convince the doubtful captain that her mission to save the Dauphin Charles and bring him to his royal coronation at Reims was divinely mandated, i.e., God was on her side. She had previously met Baudricourt twice and had been rejected, but, well, this time he seemed to agree and set up an escort to the Dauphin's court in Chinon. The Chronique de la Pucelle claims that during the encounter with Baudricourt, Joan revealed that the Dauphin's army had experienced a significant setback that day close to Orléans, and that more would be sent to him if she wasn't sent right away. Thus, when Vaucouleurs learned of the defeat at Rouvray, Baudricourt was persuaded of the girl's foresight and consented to accompany her. Well, regardless of the veracity of the story, it's always up for debate. Not all authorities agree with it, of course. Joan departed Vaucouleurs for Chinon on February 23rd. Of course, all over France there were these hazy predictions about her armoured maiden who would save France, and they've been going on for quite some time. Several of these predictions predicted that the armoured maiden would originate from the Lorraine borders, which was where Joan was born in Domremy. Consequently, there were great hopes and expectations when news of Joan's trip to see the Dauphin reached the besieged citizens of Orléans. In fact, well, they'd take anything they could get at that moment. So Joan met the skeptic Le Tremoille when she arrived in Chinon on March 6, 1429, escorted by a number of Baudricourt's soldiers. She eventually met Dauphin Charles on March the 9th, but it would take a few more days before she had a private meeting in which the Dauphin was persuaded of her powers, or at least her value. However, he did demand that she first travel to Poitiers, so she could be inspected by church officials. They had to make sure everything was up to standard, of course. So on March 22nd, Dauphin Charles finally agreed to hire her after a clerical ruling determining that she was safe to take on. She received a banner, a page boy, heralds, and a full, bright, shiny new suit of plate armor. So her first task was to accompany a convoy that was gathering at Blois and carrying supplies to Orléans under the leadership of Marshal Jean de la Brosse, Lord of Boussac. Joan wrote her well-known letters to the English siege commanders from Blois, referring to herself as the Maiden, La Pucelle, and directing them to "Be gone, or I will make you go in the name of God." Now, either on April 27th or 28th, the relief convoy finally departed Blois in a nearly religious processional array, accompanied by 400 to 500 soldiers. With the intention of engaging them right away, Joan had insisted on approaching Orléans from the north, through the Beauce region, where the English forces were gathered in strength. However, without informing Joan, the commanders chose to lead the convoy in a detour around the south, through the Salone region, arriving at Rouly, about 4 miles east of the city, on the south bank of the Loire. Jean de Dunois, the commander of Orléans, emerged to greet them on the other side of the river. The closest English bastille on the south bank, St. Jean le Blanc, was attacked right away by Joan, who was actually outraged by the deception. However, Dunois, backed by the marshals, argued and eventually persuaded her to let the city be restocked before attacking anything. Across the river from the English bastille of St. Loup on the north bank, the provisions convoy neared Port St. Loup's landing. A fleet of boats from Orléans sailed down the landing to retrieve Joan and 200 soldiers and the supplies, while the French skirmishers held the English garrison of St. Loup in check. The winds that had carried the boats upriver abruptly turned around enabling them to sail back to Orléans without incident in the dark, according to one of Joan's alleged miracles. To much celebration, Joan of Arc triumphantly entered Orléans on April 29th at 8 p.m. The convoy's remaining members went back to Blois. Joan periodically went around the streets of Orléans to distribute food to the populace and garrison salaries in an effort to raise spirits over the course of the following few days. The English commanders responded to Joan of Arc's messengers, demanding their departure from the English bastions with a good dose of mockery with it. Some even referred to the messengers as emissaries of a witch and threatened to kill them. Of course, we all know what happened to Joan of Arc at the hands of the English. I won't ruin it for you if you don't know. Well, according to Pernod, the journal The Siege of Orléans notes that Joan and Jean de Dunois, the Duke of Orléans, illegitimate half-brother, and the chief leader overseeing the city's defense on behalf of the captured Duke, had multiple conversations over the course of the following week, and on May the 1st, Dunois left the city in La Hire's control and travelled personally to Blois to organize reinforcements, because he thought that the garrison was simply too small to take any decisive action. Joan went outside the city walls during this break and personally inspected all the English fortifications, even speaking with William Glasdale, the English commander. Dunois' reinforcement convoy departed Blois for Orléans on May the 3rd. Convoys of other English troops also departed from Montargis and Gien toward Orléans at the same time. Early on the 4th of May, Dunois' military convoy reached the north bank of the river via the Beauce district, right in front of the English garrison at Saint-Laurent. Because of the convoy's strength, the English chose not to contest its entry. Joan escorted it herself, riding on a horse. Dunois and the Montargis-Gien troops attacked the easterly English Bastille of Saint-Loup on noon on May the 4th. At noon on May the 4th, 1429. Good Lord. Ostensibly to secure the entry of additional provision convoys that had taken the customary roundabout route via the east. Now, Joan was sleeping when the attack started, so she almost missed it, but she rushed and joined in eventually. The 1,500 French attackers greatly outnumbered the 400-man English garrison. The English commander, Lord John Talbot, attacked from Saint-Poire, on the northern end of Orléans, hoping to distract the French, but a French sortie stepped in and stopped it. About 40 prisoners were taken, and 140 English were killed when Saint-Loup fell a few hours later. And apparently at Joan's request, some of the English defenders were actually spared when they captured in the ruins of a nearby church. Talbot withdrew the northern attack after learning that Saint-Loup had fallen. A good day for the French, it seems. Joan called for an assault on the biggest English outpost now, the Bastille of Saint-Laurent to the west, on Accession Day, May 5th. However, the French captains had their own ideas and persuaded her to let them celebrate the feast day in peace, because they understood its power and the need for the rest for their men. The best course of action was determined in a war council that night to clear the English bastions on the south bank, where the English were most vulnerable. Early on May the 6th, the procedure got underway. To the chagrin of professional commanders, the people of Orléans organized urban militias on Joan of Arc's behalf and gathered at the gates. Joan, however, persuaded the experts to permit the militia to join in. Using boats and barges, the French crossed the river from Orléans and landed on the island of St. Ainan. They then crossed a makeshift pontoon bridge to the south bank and landed on the section between the bridge complex and the Battle of Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, the Bastille of Saint-Jean-Blanc, rather. The English garrison commander, William Glasdale, had already quickly destroyed the St. Jean-le-Blanc outwork and gathered his forces in the central Boulevard Tourelles Augustins complex after spotting the French's operations intention. The original plan had been to cut off and capture St. Jean-le-Blanc from the west. Well, that was the original plan, at least. La Hire allegedly launched a sudden attack on Boulevard's strong point, an outlying fortification south of Les Tourelles, before the French had properly disembarked on the south bank. This almost became disastrous, because the Augustines' English fire exposed the flanks of the assault. Cries that the English garrison of the Bastille Saint-Prive further west was hurrying upriver to reinforce Glasdale and cut them off caused the assault to break out. When panic struck, the French assailants pulled Joan along with them as they fled from the boulevard and returned to the landing grounds. The legend goes that Joan turned around on them alone, raised her holy standard, and cried out, "Au nom de Dieu," in the name of God, which was apparently enough to impress the English to stop their pursuit and return to the boulevard when they saw the quote-unquote witch fleeing and the quote-unquote spell broken. Turning around, the escaping French soldiers gathered around her. The fortified monastery of Les Augustins was then attacked by the French commanders, and eventually was captured just before dusk. Glasdale's garrison in the Tourelles complex was blockaded, and the Augustines were now in French hands. The remnants of the English garrison at Saint-Prive left their outpost that same evening and moved north up the river to join their fellow soldiers at Saint-Laurent. Despite his remote location, Glasdale could only rely on a robust and established English garrison consisting of 700 to 800 soldiers. During the attack on the Augustins, Joan stepped on a metal spike and hurt her foot. She was transported back to Orléans for the night to recuperate. She consequently did not attend the war council in the evening. To the delight of the residents of Orléans, she refused to miss the last attack on Boulevard Tourelles on May 7th, and was roused to join the French camp on the south bank. In support of her, the populace increased levies and began repairing the bridge with beams, so that the complex could be attacked from both sides. The island of Saint Antoine had its own artillery positions. And so Joan was quickly removed after being hit by a longbow arrow between her neck and left shoulder, early in the morning while she was still standing in the trench south of Les Tourelles. Rumors of her passing weakened French morale and strengthened English defenders. Witnesses, however, did claim that she came back later that night and informed the soldiers that the fortress would be taken in a final attack. Jean Pasquerel, Joan's confessor and chaplain, later claimed that Joan herself had some kind of premonition, or this foreknowledge of her wound, declaring the day before the attack that "tomorrow blood will flow from my body above my breast." Les Tourelles were beaten back from additional attacks throughout the day. Jean de Dunois had made the decision to postpone the last attack until the following day, since evening was drawing near. After informing the troops of the decision, Joan left for a time of silent prayer before returning to the region south of Les Tourelles and declaring that the area would be theirs as soon as her banner touched the fortress wall. "All is yours. Go in," was Joan's response to a soldier who yelled, "It's touching the wall," referring to the banner. Swarming up the ladders into the fortification, the French soldiers rushed in. The English were driven from the boulevard and back into the Tourelles' final redoubt by the French, who won the day. Glasdale died after falling into the river, after the drawbridge that connected them collapsed. The Tourelles itself was stormed by the French from both sides. The bridge had since been fixed, and in the evening, half burning nonetheless, the Tourelles was finally captured. Of course, the English, feeling quite sorry for themselves, had to come to terms with their defeat. They had suffered 600 prisoners and almost 1,000 casualties, including the interception of reinforcements hurried to the defense and other actions during the day. After being discovered in the complex, 200 French prisoners were set free. On the south bank of the Loire, it was lost to the English when the Tourelles complex was captured. Since Orléans could now be readily resupplied indefinitely, there was very little reason to keep up the siege. The English troops on the north bank, led by Lord John Talbot and the Earl of Suffolk, destroyed their outworks and formed a battle line in the field close to Saint-Laurent on the morning of May 8th. In front of them was Dunois' French army. Before the English had left the field and marched off to join the other English units in Meung, Beaugency, and Jargeau, they stood facing each other, motionless, for approximately an hour. To immediately destroy the English army, some of the French commanders called for an attack. But according to reports, Joan of Arc prohibited it. Because after all, it was Sunday, and that's the Lord's day of rest. The English, of course, didn't think that they were completely defeated. Even though they'd lost pretty badly at Orléans, they still controlled the Beaugency, Meung, and Janville, and Jargeau areas that surrounded the region. Since the bridge had been repaired, and was therefore more vulnerable to attack, the English could, in fact, quickly reorganize and recommence the siege, possibly with even greater success this time. That day, the 8th of May, saving what was left of the English forces, was, however, Suffolk's top priority. Joan was not as aware of this as the French commanders were. On May 13th, she left Orléans and met the Dauphin Charles outside of Tours to announce her triumph. The French commanders knew that they had first to drive the English from their perilous positions on the Loire, but she ordered a march right away, heading northeast into Champagne towards Reims. A few weeks later, following a period of reinforcement and rest, the Loire campaign got underway. The French army was bolstered by men and supplies who were willing to serve under Joan of Arc's leadership. Arthur de Richemont, a constable who had been shunned, was eventually allowed to join the campaign. The Loire returned to French control following a string of short sieges and conflicts at Jargeau, Meung, and Beaugency on the 12th, 15th, and 17th of June, respectively. Shortly after, on June 18th, French forces achieved their first major field victory in years when they routed an English reinforcement army led by John Talbot that was rushing from Paris. During the campaign, the English commanders, Talbot and the Earl of Suffolk, were also captured. The French felt secure enough to grant Joan's request for a march on Reims only after that. Following some preparation, the Dauphin Charles led Joan and the French army through the perilous Burgundian-occupied region of Champagne as they marched on Reims from Gien on June the 29th. Saint-Florentin gave way on the 3rd of July, as did Troyes on the 11th of July and Chalon-sur-Marne on the 15th, despite the fact that Auxerre closed its gates on the 1st of July and denied them entry. Well, the following day, 2nd of July, they arrived in Reims, and on July 17th, 1429, the Dauphin Charles was formally crowned King Charles VII of France, with Joan by his side. Mission accomplished.
Okay, how'd you like that one? That was a bit of fun, wasn't it? Oh, one can only imagine the presence of Joan of Arc showing up at Orléans. Beautiful. Like a poem. Anyway, thank you to the top-tier patrons and supporters. Dark, Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Lekitmus, Carrie, Charlene, Lynn Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Erin, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review on YouTube, Scott, Stark Factory, Shell, Wendy, and Josie. And I will see you all in the next video. Good night, and lots of love to you all.